Hi, morning. We're not hearing anything from the speaker, people. We're not hearing anything.
My many years on this planet, I have never seen before. So we offer a special welcome to our students. And is Mr. Zulu online? I am honored to invite Mr. Dennis Zulu, the director of the ILO office in the Caribbean. Mr. Zulu, prior to his current assignment, worked as the director of the ILO country office in Abuja with responsibility for Nigeria, Ghana, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and as the representative to the economic community of West African states. Mr. Zulu brings extensive experience and knowledge on key issues related to the areas of the ILO Caribbean office. As director of ILO Abuja, he led development projects and activities on employment creation, entrepreneurship development, microfinance, and social dialogue. Before joining the ILO in 2003, Mr. Zulu worked in academia and in the private sector in his home country. In the ILO, he has worked in various positions, including program officer in the ILO office in Zambia, the ILO coordinator for the UN pilot Delivering as One program in Mozambique, and the UN advisor on youth employment and empowerment in the Liberian government. Mr. Zulu holds a degree in economics and public administration from the University of Zambia, a postgraduate diploma from Stellenbosch University, South Africa, and a master's in business administration, corporate finance, and strategic planning from Mozambique University in Tanzania. I have the honor to invite Mr. Dennis Zulu to bring us greetings. Dennis? Dennis, may I ask you to just pause a moment, please? We need to rectify something quickly. Go ahead. My apologies, Dennis, if you can, please. Dennis, could we ask you, Dennis, it seems as though the problem is on your end. Could we ask you to log out and log back in, please? My apologies.
Hello, Andre. Is this any better?
That is perfect, Dennis. Thank you so much.
Okay, excellent. Okay. All right, so let me just continue from where I left off. So once again, good morning. And again, let me just thank the Cipriani College of Labor and Cooperative Studies for allowing me to speak on behalf of the International Labour Organization at this very important conference on the Caribbean climate justice, reducing vulnerability in the Caribbean through climate justice and building cooperative response. As we all know, climate change continues to be one of the biggest obstacles to social justice and transformation faced by small island development states in the Caribbean and indeed worldwide. But this is not a new revelation. The impacts of climate change are real to those of us that live and work in the Caribbean. In fact, this morning, as you can all see, we're suffering already from the heavy rains that we had from the impact of climate change. And indeed, again, we've seen the loss of lives and livelihoods over the past few days. And because climate change indeed does affect us on a day-to-day basis. The loss of lives and livelihoods create economic and social implications that are experienced on a yearly basis and have impacts that last decades. We acknowledge the human contribution to climate change and that this activity is tied to the way we work, produce, and consume. If climate change is a consequence of human activity, then that activity is for the most part related to the work that we do on a daily basis. Climate change impacts workers' health and safety, income stability, productivity, and we must also continue to make efforts to fight against its impacts. Talking words and pledges, unfortunately, without action will not provide the results that we seek. And as such, it's imperative that governments, together with workers, employers, should be at the center of developing and innovating strategies that will mitigate against the impacts of climate change. A deep transformation of our models of production and consumption is therefore required. But it is also very evident that the shift towards greener economies must also come with it in a fair and inclusive plan. From the perspective of the world of work, moving towards a sustainable future is imperative for all of us. Jobs, productivity, workers' health and safety, income stability are already impacted by climate change, but be it in form of heat waves or rain, as we've seen in the past few days. When we speak of the just transition and the greening of the economy, we must hold in our minds that transitioning must be done in a way that is fair and inclusive as possible to everyone concerned in creating decent work opportunities and leaving no one behind. This means that we must make sure that the policies that shape this transition also support social and economic equity. Consequently, actors in the world of work, and that includes governments, workers, and employers, must be central to the strategies that we need to prevent, mitigate, and adapt to climate change. The process to get there, however, will not occur overnight, and it will not occur without support and consultations amongst all members of government, workers' unions, and employers. The scale and the work towards a transition that is just for all of us, especially the most vulnerable, is not a small one, and it is one that will require continuous commitment to dialogue. And that is why, in 2015, a tripartite group of experts came together in the ILO to elaborate what was a just transition, or what a just transition may mean with the development of guidelines for a just transition towards environmentally sustainable economies. The guidelines emphasize that if we are to achieve a just transition, policymakers need to use social justice, social dialogue. This is the most effective way to maximize employment and income opportunities and to minimize social and economic disruptions. Research indicates that there are indeed vast opportunities for job creations globally. And by 2030, as you know, when the SDGs will formally come to an end, there is an opportunity to create 24 million jobs worldwide, especially in the sectors of renewable energy, energy efficiency, and transportation. However, beyond the number of jobs, it's also imperative that transitioning to greener economies also holds at its center decent work, whatever the shape the economy takes. The greening of economies can enhance our ability to manage natural resources sustainably, increase energy efficiency, reduce waste, while also promoting social justice and addressing poverty, inequality, and gender gaps. And this is why the ILO supports events such as the one being held today, because everyone here holds a seat around the table to ensure social justice forms part of the discussion in promoting resilience against climate change impacts for the most vulnerable. I thank you once again for this opportunity and wish you a productive meeting over the next 2 days. Thank you and good morning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dennis Zulu, and the college looks forward to the continuing collaboration with your office. Mr. Oro Fraser is the Regional Coordinator Caribbean for the Open Society Foundations. Oro Fraser is from Guyana. He lives in Colombia and leads OSF's first ever Caribbean strategy with an emphasis on climate justice. Oro previously worked with national and international civil society organizations, the United Nations Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the International Criminal Court, living at different times in Nigeria, Egypt, Guatemala, Colombia, Switzerland, the Netherlands, the UK, and Spain. He has specialized in security-related human rights issues, including investigations, anti-discrimination, prevention of torture, rights-based policing, intelligence reforms, democratic oversight, transitional justice, and the motives of perpetrators, among others. Oro has an LLM with distinction in international human rights law from the University of Essex, and previously graduated with a first-class honors degree in international relations. He is fluent in English and Spanish. He is a music addict, a bad but happy jazz pianist, and the proud father of a girl and boy. My friend, Oro Fraser.
Can you hear me, Andre?
We're hearing you perfectly.
I think the video is suspended, so if the computer people could help me to activate it, that would be great, please.
Working.
It's telling me it's disabled.
You're still coming up disabled, Laura?
Yeah. I'm happy to, there.
Yeah. You're on. Yes.
All right. Thank you very much, Andre, for the introduction. And really just to congratulate Cipriani for putting together such a timely and relevant gathering. You know, Cipriani is one of the leading organizations in the region addressing workers' issues, and it's great to see it taking on the existential challenges of climate in this process. And I wanted to greet all the fellow speakers on the agenda for over the next 2 days and my co-panelist. I wanted to talk a bit about why OSF is interested in supporting this event and other climate justice events in the Caribbean. OSF is the world's largest private human rights and democracy philanthropy. Since 2020, it's been supporting Caribbean leadership on climate justice, because those least responsible for the climate crisis are those most affected by it. And they are also those the most affected need to be at the forefront of solutions. That term applies in terms of countries in the world, SIDS, the most affected and the least responsible, but also it applies within countries. And some of the most affected within our countries are the least engaging on solutions or the least included in solutions. So OSF supports 3 lines of work on climate justice in and from the Caribbean. The first one is global. So we support Caribbean visions in the international climate development and finance negotiations on critical, including issues of loss and damage and so on. And we also supporting Caribbean initiatives to have greater engagement, just and respectful engagement by richer nations on climate cooperation. The second area of work is sort of support to governments to develop and implement rights-based climate policy. And rights-based climate policy is all about participation, meaningful participation, accountability. You don't just announce the policy and then things go out not as foreseen. Also non-discrimination and transparency, because there's money coming into the region for climate finance, not enough, but governments need to be held to account for how that money is used. So a rights-based climate policy is very important to us in supporting governments on that. And finally, and most importantly for me, people within the region. We're supporting the voices of rights holders from different sectors, including workers, young feminists, indigenous peoples, coastal dwellers, and so on, to engage in climate policy at regional, national, and local levels to make it more effective and, as I say, hold governments and others to account. So I'm very excited at these conversations over the next few days because it touches on all the intersecting areas of climate justice. But I'd like to take advantage of this brief introduction just to highlight a particular interest for us, and it's that of just transitions. As you all know, the just transitions are about economic and social actions necessary to protect the rights and maximize the well-being of workers, their families, and their communities in the process of responding to the climate crisis. Climate change is obviously, the gentleman who spoke before me, is creating change across all aspects of our lives, in our rising seas, in the unpredictable and extreme weather, in the variations in our flora and fauna, and in the need to switch to from fossil fuels to sustainable energy. All sectors and all people are affected. And any effective response to the climate crisis also means change, complete change. So achieving global net zero objectives will require unprecedented economic, industrial, and technological transformation in the Caribbean and worldwide. But climate justice is about people, not just the technical. So the idea of just transitions places a spotlight on the social aspects of the response and the need to analyze, plan, and act around the risks and the opportunities for workers and their communities, particularly those who are least able to adapt to the changing context. At an international level then, just transitions is an evolving concept that has been reaffirmed in the Paris Agreement of 2015 and gained momentum in 2021 at the COP in Glasgow at the climate conference. Caribbean states have played an important role in pushing the issue forward. However, there needs to be much more public discussion and analysis in the region on the issue, including amongst workers themselves. We need to get more of that conversation and analysis about workers' conditions, how to protect them, how to support them, their families and the communities to be more prosperous, healthy, and happy in the future. As such, I hope that this event by Cipriani serves to seed the issue further and seed further discussion between workers, governments, and the private sector on how to ensure that the transitions that occur ensure the greatest advantage for people. transitions is an essential piece of the climate justice challenge we face. So I'd like to wish, again, everybody happy discussions. Thank Cipriani, and very much looking forward to what is going to happen today, tomorrow, and afterward. Thank you so much, Andre.
Thank you very much, Oro. Your encouragement and your continued support is deeply appreciated. Our keynote speaker for this morning is Dr. Dale Rankin, who will be speaking to us on dimensions and implications of the climate crisis for the Caribbean. Dr. Rankin is an applied climate scientist and research fellow with a PhD in physics with high commendation from the University of the West Indies, Mona. I see in my brief, it starts as Pastor Rankin. Is that correct? Is that correct? Well, I don't want to detract from anything from the distinguished gentleman. But Dale received his undergraduate education at the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill, earning first-class honors in meteorology and mathematics in 2000. In 2001, he received a postgraduate certificate in crop weather modeling from the Regional Meteorological Training Center in Israel. His MSc is from Surmis UWI at Cave Hill in natural resource management, majoring in climate change. Indeed, a pastor of the Truth Tabernacle United Pentecostal Church, he has worked as an agricultural climate modeling researcher with the Mona Climate Studies Group. Dr. Rankin is widely recognized as a climate change expert and has delivered presentations, published peer-reviewed papers, and written extensively on the state of Caribbean climate. Pastor Dr. Dale Rankin.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm very happy to be here joining you. I trust you can all hear me. Can somebody just give me an indication if you're able to hear me? I just want to be sure.
Hearing you clearly, Dale.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much, Chair. I'm very undeserving, I must say, of the introduction that was given to you, Chair. I think I'll have to speak to the person who wrote that brief. Maybe I could hire them as a publicist. But let me commend the Cipriani College for having this event. I think it's very timely. And I want to especially thank my very good colleague, Mr. Steve Maxime, who actually recommended, I understand, for some unknown reason, me to give this talk. I'm not sure why he think I would be qualified so to do. But I have 30 minutes within which to bring home the context of the climate crisis to you. And laden with such a mandate in such a short period of time, I know I'll have to go out almost swinging like you're in a T10 match and you're in the last over and you have to get 20 runs off 3 balls, which is near impossible. I was asked to speak on the particular subject, dimensions and implications of the climate crisis for the Caribbean. And whenever I think Caribbean and I think climate crisis, there's one thing that comes to my mind. Or several things could come to yours, but there's one thing that comes to my mind. It's the whole subtitle of what is called the 1.5 degrees Celsius, or the 1.5 climate crisis. And so I want to examine the science of this 1.5 in the context of the Caribbean. And I hope by the end of the presentation, everybody will know what 1.5 means, why it is such a critical threshold, and why it represents both a crisis and an opportunity for the Caribbean. I want to acknowledge Professor Michael A. Taylor, who is a chief lead author of the IPCC, whose wisdom I relied heavily on for this presentation and who helped significantly in this context. So let me say that the Caribbean has strongly advocated for a slogan called 1.5 to stay alive. And it was it came out of the notion of the Paris Agreement, which was aforementioned in 2015, which suggests that the average global temperature should be kept well below 2 degrees Celsius, above pre-industrial levels. Now, initially when this notion was put forward, small island states actually felt that this target was not ambitious enough. Why? Because already all the hurricanes that we're seeing, all the increases in temperatures that we're seeing, the sea level rise that we've experienced, is only because of a 1 degree rise in the last century. In other words, 0.1 degrees Celsius per decade. And we're saying if 1 degree has already done this, then we can only rise by a further 0.5 in the next century. So 1 plus 0.5 gives you 1.5 in 2 centuries. I want you to remember that, because it's going to be the bedrock for why we're really in a crisis. So 1.5 really says, since we have already risen by 1, we can only take 0.5 more. So it's a little of a misnomer when somebody said we need to rise by 1.5. No, 1.5 meaning from 1850 to 2100. All right? Okay. So having said that, there's a publication that was done. It has 5 chapters, 91 authors from 40 different countries, 133 contributing authors, over 6,000 cited reference papers. I hope I'm convincing you to go and read it. It's available on the IPCC website. Why is it important? Is because most of our developed country partners don't have to worry about the 1.5. In 2004, when Hurricane Ivan destroyed Grenada, and it destroyed Miami and sections of southern United States, President Bush was up in New York campaigning. We don't have that luxury of excess lands. And so we had to do a study to prove that this 1.5 represented a critical threshold for small island development states. So everybody needs to get an opportunity, take the chance to read this. What I'm going to try and do over the course of the next 26 minutes is to present to you some words of advice from science. And I want you to remember 3 key pieces of advice. If you remember absolutely nothing else from this keynote address, I want you to remember just 3 things. 3 things only. The first one is, let's wise up. What do I mean? We have already seen a 1 degree rise in temperature, and it is already very challenging. As you've seen here in this graphic, it is showing temperatures from 1880 all the way to 2020. You've seen that we've had significant increases in temperature. You can see this graph that is in a linear increase in temperature. 2016 and 2020 has tied for the warmest years on record. And that is a real significant challenge. Now, I gather 2021 might have even been warmer, and so 2022. So we're seeing continued increases in record-breaking temperatures. It's hotter. And it's not just hotter in the days, it's also hotter in the night. And so we've seen 23 more hot days and hot nights since 1950. Earlier and longer summers, that's a problem for us. But not only that, our rainfall is more variable. So when it is dry, it's very dry. And when it is wet, it is exceedingly wet. And so what we're seeing is very rainfall pattern. And some places are getting wetter, while some places are getting drier. So the nature of rainfall is changing. So nobody can tell you anymore, this is what a normal rainfall season looks like. Case in point, we have what we call a bimodal rainfall pattern. Bi means two peaks of rainfall. In Jamaica, typically, and in other Caribbean islands, in Jamaica where I'm from, you get a primary peak in September, October, and a secondary peak in May, June. Well, that's what we were taught. And when I was doing my PhD, that's what I understood. Well, we did a recent study and it found that in the last 25 years, we're getting more rainfall in May, June than we're getting in September, October. So if all our rainfall patterns, if all our economic activity is centered around the September, October period, already we are starting behind the 8th ball, all right? But not only do we have higher temperatures and we also have more variable rainfall, we also have more extreme events, right? So when we have drought events, very significant. In the last decades, for example, we've had a very significant drought period, 2009 to 2010, and 2013 to 2016. At the end of 2016, all the governments were sufficiently mobilized that we needed to do something about drought. We have to do something about drought. Well, good luck with that, because at the end of 2017, rainfall started again and everybody forgot the drought plan. And that's how we are. We're very episodic in our planning. Hurricanes are getting stronger. I don't need to expand on that too much. And of course, whenever we have sea level rise is accounted for by a couple of things. Number one, some of our islands are tilted slightly towards the south, especially in Jamaica, for example. So you have what is called apparent sea level rise. So if there was no glacial melt, if there was no melting of the ice caps, we would still experience relative sea level rise. But the one that is occasioned by climate change includes, number one, melting of sea ice and snow cover. And number two, when you boil water or water gets hotter, it actually expands. So we're getting both upward and outward expansion of our sea level rise. And so our shorelines are retreating in most of our islands. So the Caribbean is already experiencing changes in multiple ways. It's not behaving the way it used to. So it is now becoming unfamiliar. It is hotter, rainfall is more variable, we have more extreme events, and we have higher sea level. So the Caribbean climate profile goes like this. We are small. Our exclusive economic zones are often larger than the land area. All right. And so our sea area is many times larger than the land area. Most of our population, with very few exceptions, live within a few kilometers of the coast. In many cases, we either live on the floodplain or we live on a slope. So we're either going to have landslide or flooding, one way or the other. We're very isolated. 90% of us are in the tropics. Seasonally, we're affected by extreme events. I mean, some people say that there's a contract between Met Service and the supermarkets. They tell you that a hurricane is coming and everybody go panic by it. They don't even listen. All of a sudden, everybody's a meteorologist now. And I find meteorologists that are begging you to subscribe to their channel. The intention is to make money from YouTube. And so rather than relying on the people who are scientists, I'm not trying to advance my own ego here. I'm just talking about our Met Service. Everybody is listening to YouTube and then blaming the Met Service when the forecast is not right. So we have climate variability, we have droughts, we have flooding, and so the weather patterns are changing. We are flat, low-lying for most of the time, right? And in many cases, our very important coastlines are narrow, low-lying, and in some cases we have mountainous backbone. Dominica, Jamaica in particular are examples of this. So we either have very flat land that has no mitigation against flooding, or we have very high lands. So the natural resource dependency is another problem, because what we have is an intimate relationship between our oceans and other economic activities like our fisheries, our tourism, and so on. And so whenever there is dumping of waste in our waters, our coastal waters, or erosion, or any kind of deposit, from land into our oceans, it affects our tourism product. Most of our activities, agriculture included, are exclusively rain-fed with no supplemental irrigation. And that creates another problem. Our aquifers are along the coast, and what has happened as a result of that is that we're getting a lot of what we call brackish water, that is saline intrusion into freshwater systems. And of course, there are greater issues now emerging from the use of renewable energy sources, all right? Of course, this is something that is important, because if we can transition to less carbon intensive fuels, it gives us a fighting chance. But of course, the island life, we are structured to take advantage of our ambient or local conditions. And so that defines what normal is. So when it's raining and the farmer is very happy, we say it's bad weather. I don't know that rain is bad weather. And part of our problem is that we don't harvest our natural resources. We don't harvest rainfall. And soon after the rainfall, we're worried about drought. Our outdoor life is affected by this. So when you put everything together, what do we get? We get a carbon profile that has a strong, intimate, and direct relationship and linkages between our climate, the existence, our economies and standard of living, and our way of life. By that, I am saying the Caribbean life and development is predicated on what we call a familiar climate. But the climate change is introducing challenge to this familiarity. So now we have the challenge of the unfamiliar. And so it is becoming increasingly harder for the Caribbean as a climate sensitive region to consistently develop in the face of climate change. And I'll give you a very quick example. Here's an index of agricultural productivity. Every time you see one of those little common looking things as a hurricane, you can see the dips in our production. Every time we have a hurricane, you can see where the mouse is. We have a dip in significant productivity. As soon as a hurricane gives us a break, productivity goes back up. We had a nice little period here. We had no major event. And boom, everything's going back up. Then we have a flood event and we're back down again. And the same is true for almost any other sector. Then we start seeing problems. Initially when we had flooding, for example, there's just a little issue where, we send out a notice that we cannot, send water. Then the flooding start to affect roads and transportation. When we have a drought situation, initially we talk about drought, conserving water, and then it begins to expand beyond conserving and water. And now it starts shutting down schools and so on. So we expand, all right? And so we have everything becoming more and more unfamiliar. So the first piece of advice is wise up. What do I mean? We are already at a 1 degree Celsius increase in temperature, and it is challenging. And that challenges our development pillars, which are now becoming unreliable. So if the first thing I wanted to remember from this talk is wise up, in the next 17 minutes, I wanted to remember 2 other things. Number 2, we have to heads up. We have to start looking up because we are on track now. I mentioned that we don't want to exceed more than 1.5 degrees Celsius total, adding the 1 to n. But we are on track now to overshoot 2 degrees Celsius. So if 1 degree is giving us all this Hurricane Ian and Hurricane Ivan and everything, and now we're on track to exceed 2, that is worrying. So the future is calling for anything above 2 degrees Celsius, that's what we're seeing. If you look on this map here, you're seeing much warmer temperatures, up to 3 to 4 degrees Celsius increase by the end of the century. Remember what we said, we only want a further 0.5. We're on track to go to 3 to 4 degrees. 30 to 98% of the days annually will be regarded as being hot by 2090. And only 2% will be cool by 2080. Even drier conditions, initially we had said we were variable. Now we are going to be both variable and dry, up to 40% drier. And this drying, unfortunately, for those of us who are farmers, is going to occur in the principal crop season. Shorter rainy season, longer and more severe droughts. That's what it's calling for. And there's a reference down there by Campbell et al. 2010, by Carmichael et al. 2013, Taylor et al. 2013 as well. And we're having even higher sea levels, up to 1 meter of sea level rise by the end of the century. Now that's kind of scary because we were talking in terms of centimeters in the last century. More intense hurricanes. Now, there is, and I don't want to scare anybody, there is division in opinion regarding whether we will have more hurricanes or less hurricanes. Some models, and I want to say all models are wrong, but some are useful. Most models are saying, well, there will be an increase in intensity. So whether you get more storms or not, you only really want 1 hurricane for a season for it to be bad. And what all the models are united on is that we will get more intense hurricanes, meaning category 4 and 5 or category 3 to 5 or high. That's scary, all right? So when we look at this, therefore, what we're seeing here is that under 1.5 degrees Celsius increase relative to pre-industrial levels, we're talking about 2 droughts or so on and so forth. But of course, under 2 degrees, 10 droughts and moderate droughts and 12 droughts we're talking about. As we increase, severe droughts we're seeing remains the same whether it's 1.5 or 2, but a massive increase relative to a 2.5 increase. So what we're seeing is that the category of the drought increases significantly, considering just an 11-year period centered on when the warming target is attained. So the future entrenchment of a climate regime will be marked by something outside the bounds of what we experienced in the present, what we call, if the first one was unfamiliar, this is now unprecedented. We're getting temperatures up to 4 degrees warmer, more variable rainfall and drier, more extreme events, and certainly more sea level rise, right? So this was 3.5 millimeters. if you do the multiplication and take that 3.5 per year and multiply it by 100, then you get 350 millimeters. All right, and 350 millimeters is 0.35 meters. Now we're talking about 1.0 meters. So the future is going to look a whole lot different. And let's look at something here, more intense hurricanes. We have several hurricanes in the basin at the same time. 2017, 2019, 2020, and here is 2022. We went to our beds one night, it was a tropical storm. By the next day, it's a Category 5 hurricane. Crazy stuff, right? That is the problem that we're facing. All right, unprecedented climate also means unprecedented impacts. Whenever we have impacts, they are just so overwhelming. I saw what happened with Irma and Maria in the US Virgin Islands. I saw what happened in Grenada with Hurricane Ivan. In my own country, Jamaica, I had the honor of writing the report for the Met Service in another incarnation when I worked at the Met Service. And what was interesting was that Hurricane Ivan did not make landfall on Jamaica. It was at best a Category 4 at 40 kilometers away the eye, but we had significant impacts from it, right? The World Travel Report, was talking about some of the impacts that we were having. And it was saying that the islands that were badly hit were worst affected, but there were other islands that were not necessarily directly hit, but they had significant impacts. And
Excuse me.
Hello?
Dale, are you seeing that your power is low?
My power?
Yes, it's saying plug in your PC.
No.
That's not you?
No, that's not it.
Oh, okay.
No, my PC is plugged in, sir. Okay, thanks, Chair. All right, so in 2017 alone, we lost over 826,000 visitors to the Caribbean compared to pre-hurricane forecast. And these visitors would have generated over $741 million and supported over 1,000 jobs. That's just one event, one hurricane season. Never mind other things that we have no control over, like COVID, right? So that is just to show the effect of one event, all right? Now, apart from that, there will likely be impacts on things like that determine the quality of life. We mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals. Well, all of these goals are going to be affected by climate change, every single one of them, right? Because our development goals are being threatened. So if the first thing that I mentioned was that we need to wise up, we are already at 1 degree Celsius, and it's already challenging. And 1 degree Celsius, our development pillars are unreliable. Then heads up is saying, look, we are on track to overshoot 2 degrees Celsius, and it is more than worrying. Therefore, our development pillars are now becoming unattainable if we go anything above 2 degrees Celsius. I hope you already see that we're in a serious crisis. But I don't like to end a presentation with bad news. If you go to the doctor and he gives you a terminal diagnosis without a prescription, he's giving you a death sentence. So I want to say to everybody in the conference, let's wake up. By that we mean, whether we achieve 1.5 or not, we have to act now, right now, for a livable future. This conference by the Cipriani College is one such activity that we're having to wake up everybody. Hey, look at the warning signs. Something is happening. All right. So 1.5 does not, it's not equal a safe climate for anybody. All right. We have 40% less hydropower. That was a research that was done. We have diminished agriculture productivity. We found that most of our animals are already at their upper limit of heat stress tolerance. Our regional cost of damage is 2 to 3 times higher. The median increase in aridity, or areas that are no longer viable for agriculture, increases by 4%. That is just the average increase. And of course, in St. Lucia over here, we're looking at our seaports. I did a study years ago, and I think 90% of our airports and our seaports are below sea level. So if you have a significant weather event, well, they probably have to parachute the food into land in the mountains and hope and pray somebody can reach it, because we have some significant infrastructure challenges. But this is now hitting directly at the theme of your conference, the whole notion of climate justice. Because what is happening now is that as 1.5 becomes even overshot by what we're seeing, vulnerable groups are now expanding. And so new vulnerable groups are emerging as a result of this expanded exposure. So this don't include new people like the poor, the elderly, children, persons that have health challenges, especially those with non-communicable diseases as well. Outdoor workers, you have to work outdoor. The sun is hotter. I mean, not the sun is hotter, but the temperatures are hotter. You have to take more breaks and all of that, which has implications for productivity. Our biodiversity is being affected. Our heritage sites become no longer attractive. Future generations, their ability to look after themselves become imperiled, which now hits at the heart of what we call sustainable development. Development that meets the needs of the current generation without compromising the needs of a future generation to meet its own needs. That was in the Brundtland Commission in 1992. And of course, our coastal dwellers, they have no houses anymore. You're looking right here at a place that was called Caribbean Estate in Jamaica. It was prided, and many people love to live there. All the taponaris, like our chair that have a lot of money, used to live there. You step out of your house, you step right into the sea. When Hurricane Ivan came, we had waves breaking 40 feet. It hit the house going in, and when it came back out, it took the house with it. And so Caribbean Estate is now history. And many of our coastal area, locations in Jamaica have a similar story to tell. Many of our hotels that are along the coast pretty soon from now are going to have some significant challenges. But just look at this very quick example. And just take one island, for example, in Jamaica. And you look at the number of events that we have had, the year, the frequency, the recurrence of which we have had events, and look at the impact on GDP. Sorry, I don't have these figures in US dollars, but if you're good at mathematics, you can divide these figures by 150. And this is in billions of Jamaican dollars. By any stretch of the imagination, over the course between 1999 to 2017, $128 billion. And if you just do a simple mathematics, and just divide by the 150, you're talking easily over 100 million US dollars. Now, no country can survive on that kind of thing with such recurrence. It's just not sustainable. And when you do the cumulative average of what are sum of the impact on GDP, you realize how many times you have to be rebuilding. Really, really problem. So what do we need to do if we're saying we have to wake up? We have to take strong action, mitigation, adaptation, and education. Mitigation is anything that we can do to reduce our carbon footprint, essentially. And so what the science is now calling for is a 45% reduction in CO2 by 2030 from what it was in 2010, and us becoming net zero, meaning we produce only as much carbon as we use up by 2050. Well, good luck with that catching on right now, because we're having more cars and more used cars, all of that kind of stuff. We have more waste material, and many of our sites are not waste disposal or landfills. They are dumps where we burn. So we really have to start thinking about this. Alternative energy sounds very nice, but we also have to bear in mind that wherever we're going to put our solar panels and our wind turbines, they have to also be resilient to more significant and stronger storms, right? We have to have adaptation. Adaptation is now taking advantage of any benefits or doing anything possible that you can do to avoid the negative consequences. All right, so agriculture, for example, shall we start building in more shade houses or greenhouses that are temperature controlled, for example? Our forests, we really have to stop this slash and burn agriculture. Water resources, recycling of our water is a taboo. In Israel, they recycle water 5 times and then plunge it underground, and it goes through aquifers and everything comes back up in the sun and it's ready to go another cycle. If you tell somebody, look, you're going to recycle water from your toilet, all of a sudden, everybody knows, put up in the air. But what is interesting about this, if you think about the water cycle, when all our waste get dumped in the sea, and the sea is evaporated by the sun, is somebody else's pee from 1950 you're drinking now, We all just don't realize it. When it comes down in the rain, everybody will open their mouth and drink it. But if you tell them to recycle it from the toilet, it's a problem. It's the same thing, right? We have to think about our biodiversity and so on. So we need a comprehensive adaptation agenda that considers a range of appropriate actions. It takes into account both the future challenges and records the limits. and it is consistent with the Sustainable Development Goal and recognizes that there has to be synergies and trade-offs. Now, I want to introduce you to two very quick things before in the last 2 minutes of my presentation. Something called SMASH. And when you think about SMASH, you think about somebody licking somebody in the head, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about this SMASH. And what this is a tool that we developed in the Caribbean. It's a simple model for the advection of storms and hurricanes. And here's a link here, Mr. Chair. In the interest of time, I won't go through the tool. But you can click on the website. It takes you to a site here. And when you click on the website, what really happens is that it gives you the opportunity to select a location in any country. When you select the location, it allows you to select a start and an end point. You can determine how fast you want the storm to go, how slow you want the storm to go, see the accumulation of rain, see what locations would likely be flooded and so on. It's something that we have done at the University of the West Indies. Very proud of the tool. I'm part of the team that helped to develop the tool. And it is something that is quite useful. You can slow the storm down to see what would happen if the storm went across your country in a slow manner. You can alter it in any direction that you want. It's freely available online right now via this platform here. Another one that I personally developed is called Accept. This tool now, hello? Right, so Accept it stands for Agricultural Climate Change Evaluation for Production, Transformation, and Resilience Building. What it allows you to do in this particular case, you can look at a country, any country for that man. For now, it's Jamaica. You can select a location in the island. When you select that location in the island, it actually asks you what crop do you want to plant, which variety of the crop you want to plant, and what soil, what soil do you want to use. And when you select those parameters, it then searches for the closest weather station and gives you what you can get in yield from start of the crop to the end of the crop. We can now increase that to make you alter your fertilizer treatment. You can also put in your price factors, your labor costs, your irrigation costs, and see how much money you're going to make, even before you dig the ground. All right, so that is another way we can do that. Anyway, let me close in the next 1 minute that I have. So what are the three things I want you to remember from this presentation? Number one, we have to wise up. We cannot do things the same way we're doing. We have to understand that already we are having a challenge with just a 1 degree increase in temperature above pre-industrial levels. And so our development pillars are becoming unreliable. The second thing I want us to heads up, we're on track to overshoot what is projected in the Paris Agreement already. And so this is very worrying. So our development pillars are becoming unattainable. And we must, ladies and gentlemen, wake up, because whether or not 1.5 is realized now or in the future, we have to act now to have a livable future. And so actions and our development agenda become achievable if we act now. If and only if we act now. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you very much, and I wish you all the best for your conference. God bless you. We're not hearing you, Chair.
Vivid image that for the past 65 odd years, I've been drinking 50-year-old pee. Dale, that is an image that will haunt me for the rest of my life. But I want to especially thank Steve Maxime for introducing us to Dr. Rankin. Steve did not oversell. And so we thank you so much for your very disturbing but necessary presentation. We're going to have a second part of our plenary keynote. And Dale was leading us into it, and we want to invite Lloyd Gardner to make a presentation on the intersections of social justice and climate justice. Lloyd is an environmental planner who has been involved in the environmental management in the wider Caribbean region, starting with the government of Jamaica in 1982. He became a consultant in 1992. He provided consulting services to regional and international public, intergovernmental, and civil society organizations. He is currently the executive director of the Foundation for Development Planning, Inc., based in the United States Virgin Islands. Lloyd.
Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Henry. Well, thanks to Dr. Rankin for sort of setting a sort of great context for the crisis as we know it. And for sort of getting us prompted and ready to act. As he indicated, we are in trouble. That's why they call it a crisis after all. What I'm going to try to do very quickly, we don't want another 30 minutes presentation, very quickly, is just to make some connections between climate crisis, as you just heard, and some of the routine things in our lives, what we call social, especially around social justice issues. You may get the impression, or you may have heard or read, but this climate crisis, this new thing that's happening that the world is concerned about. What I want to remind us very quickly, for most of us may already know, that there are social inequities, there are differences in how we treat groups in our society. And some people are already very vulnerable on the climate or no climate for all kinds of reasons. As Dr. Rankin mentioned, the vulnerable groups are getting actually larger because of climate. And essentially that's the link in a very simple way. These vulnerable groups existed, a number of issues created problems for them for societal reasons, but climate is an added dimension to it, which is expanding those groups and creating some new vulnerabilities. So I guess I need to do it this way. Nope. It's on. Sorry, I seem to not be technically. I'm trying to advance my slides. Sorry for those who are trying to watch this. I guess I need some help. I'm challenged with the. Here we go. Okay. Right. So if I may very quickly, just to recap something Dr. Rankin said in one slide, this is not my slide, but I like to use it. That science touches everything. Hence this link, as we say, between social justice and climate justice. If we already have inequalities, if we already have people who are vulnerable and climate makes it worse, then clearly that the injustices, the inequities, and the impact on these groups will continue. It also means that we cannot look at climate as an environmental issue, as an add-on, or as something to be addressed separately from all the other things in our lives. If it touches everything, then clearly it touches every aspect of our lives and the way the society functions. Right. Again, in words, what we just showed in photographs and what Dr. Rankin mentioned, climate touches everything. That's the graphic. It's a driver of disaster risk. When you speak to most people, they know what bad storms look like. It's part of our lives in the Caribbean, especially in the last 2 decades. But climate makes that worse. And you heard in his presentation that even if we don't get more storms and more floods, what we're getting are more extreme events that are much more damaging, that changes our lives in ways that is very difficult to recover. I think he mentioned that it takes 4 to 5 years. The data that we're getting, certainly that we're seeing from other places, actually takes 7 to 10 years. The more intense storms that we have seen in the past 2 decades is that it takes a really long time to rebuild. And especially if you're a small state or a small island, the rate at which you can do that, the pace at which you can do that is so much slower. And temporary structures as they used to provide after storms, the temporary bridge here, the makeshift thing there, doesn't quite hold up if next week or next year you're going to get another Category 5 storm. And so how we respond and the cost of response changes completely under climate change scenarios. Climate change is what we call not only a threat, but a threat multiplier. And Dr. Rankin mentioned that to some extent, is that you get a storm, then you have a housing problem, or you might have a health issue, or you might have problems feeding populations for a while afterwards. So there are all of these kinds of issues. We're not in the place where people talk about threat multipliers as wars and all of those other conflicts, but there are conflicts within societies, even in the Caribbean, in terms of access to resources, access to materials for rebuilding, and so on. So it creates certain kinds of tensions, and certainly we know about the health and mental and physical health impacts after extreme events, regardless of what they are. So it is not just the hard hit of an extreme event, but also what happens several years after in terms of the ability of the system to respond and to deliver services. We say it exacerbates existing problems. If you're in a floodplain, if you're vulnerable to flooding, those kinds of issues, if you have problems maintaining your roads, maintaining your other forms of infrastructure, climate makes that worse in a number of ways. This year, in 2022, sorry about that. We saw starting last year, but certainly this year, where in some other parts of the world, infrastructure is melting. Roads, bridges. In this year, we saw in some places where airports had to be shut down for part of the year because of extreme heat. We expect that to continue as it gets warmer. And so how do we translate what we're seeing in other places to what we're seeing in the Caribbean? Is that likely to happen here? Are we building for different conditions? And how do we expect those kinds of issues to be addressed? Back to social justice, climate change amplifies existing social and economic disparities. Who has access to resources? Who have access to services? How do we treat different groups in our society? Our economic strategies addressing the needs of our people, or some people benefiting more than others in the context of how we apply those strategies. Not that you have more and therefore you get more based on your input, but simply that some groups are not, the needs of some group are not addressed through all the way we design our societies and the way we design those. And then we look at those in a bit more. But the health and well-being we heard about, and I want to touch on this right here a little bit in a few minutes, and then later on. If human beings are at the center of all of the things we do, individually, collectively, and our health is threatened, then everything else, talking about economics doesn't make sense if you don't have healthy human beings. Not only because we're supposed to be focused on the well-being of humans, but also because you need healthy people for society to function well. And so from either perspective, we need to remember to put people at the center of this, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because we don't function as a society if we're not well. And so we want to make sure that as we go forward, again, getting us back to the concept of just transitions, how do we sort of rethink that, not just because of work and worker protection, but in a more central way, that we need to make sure that we are healthy. And then, of course, Dr. Rankin's thing was about climate sensitivity in the Caribbean. One of the points I want to make, and he said this, is essentially climate change is just a threat. For those of us in the Caribbean who are, and for other places, may hear the saying, rain falls on the just and the unjust. Climate is just a threat. How we respond to it, how we conduct our lives or business is what makes a difference in terms of how it impacts us, and certainly whether or not there are inequalities and injustices in terms of climate. So climate justice is more about how we function as a society rather than it is about climate itself. And so when we talk about climate justice, the issue is that it is not simply, there's no simple definition, because it incorporates all of the different issues around justice. Focuses on the drivers, as we know. We talk about rich and poor countries, and you'll hear more about that later on in terms of some of the loss and damage issues. We understand that the Caribbean and developing countries are not the main contributors to the problem, but we are more exposed than many other places. So there's this justice issue. You heard it again before, but certainly in our own experiences that we rely on sectors that are vulnerable to climate change, agriculture, tourism, all of these things that are extremely vulnerable. Within each sector, within each country, every group is not exposed in the same way, or vulnerabilities are different. And again, it gets back to the justice issue. How do we organize ourselves? Who has access? Who is protected? Who is not? And therefore, even within the country, how we function, the policies we use, the actions we take make a difference. And just to give you very quickly, linked to storms, 2 examples of how we think about just social justice issues and the connection to climate. Hurricane Dorian in 2019, I think 2018. And the treatment, I'm going to use Bahamas, not picking on Bahamas, it's just that it was all over the news. In terms of the treatment of Haitian workers in Bahamas, we see it in war, we see it in other places where the access to services, how you deal with a particular group is different based on whether they think you're your people or you're somebody else. We see it now in the US, we see it in Ukraine and the war. How you treat what you consider to be your people might be different. And that is one of the ways in which under extreme events or normal social behavior then has this additional feature, which is then part of climate justice. So if those were not in place, then the climate justice issues might not have been as relevant. Same thing, Hurricane Irma in 2017 in St. Martin, where authorities, in responding to the dramatic impact of Irma, decided to move or wanted to move an informal settlement from the coastline. And their thing was they were trying to protect the people who were living in this exposed vicinity. They hadn't done that before the storms. And so the question is that a climate response or is that a social response? And the extreme event provided, what should I say, a motivator in whichever way it is, or enabler to do something that should have been handled in a different way under regular social practices. And so sometimes it is very unclear which it is and what that transition is from regular social justice issues into climate justice. So again, if you're looking at if you understand how your society functions, you may be able to tell that difference, but generally it can be tricky to do that. Very quickly, we know society's functions. We know rich and poor, we know vulnerable groups, we know access, and so I don't really need to expand on that. The second bullet I will touch on a little bit in terms of our current economic paradigms. Most of us don't focus on economies, but globally, more and more, we're seeing where humans, where people, the masses of people are the primary producers, but they're also the consumers. You may remember after the terrorist attacks in the US when things went south, and the strategy was people need to go out and buy things. Their lives just got upended, but they must go out and purchase so that people can continue to make money, so that the economic activity can continue. Same thing in the pandemic. Well, we need to get back to normal so we can go back and produce. People are hurting, people are dying, but they need to get back so that economic activity can continue. And so this disconnect where people are not really at the center, but at the same time, they're necessary to produce, but they're necessary to consume, so somebody can actually, or companies can make money, or countries can have economic churn, as I call it, is really an important facet of justice normally, and certainly climate justice. Caribbean development model, most of us don't talk about development models because that's not what we do. But our development models, essentially, the model is where Caribbean economies are essentially designed for export. And by that, I mean, most of the products, most of the things that we export, the goods and services, are actually produced here for consumption elsewhere. We know about agriculture because we export a lot of raw materials, but our two main industries right now, tourism and to some extent, the economic sectors around the financial services sector, again, are based on demand elsewhere. They're not based on driving economic development here, but they're based on consumption elsewhere, even if you think the activity is here. Most of those people are not here. And so the demand elsewhere determines what happens to the viability of those sectors, determine how we organize our economies. And any shift in that has significant social impact locally, and therefore also in terms of climate change and how that impacts. If we look at some of the storms, we see where people have moved, certainly in this financial service sector, where people are moved to another island until you start recover, and then they show back up in your island. So all of us are not in the financial services sector, but that was touted as one of the ways to diversify our economy, where we thought we had some advantage. And additionally, we're beginning to see where a number of the larger countries are now talking about how we deal with the issue of tax evasion or whatever it is around taxes and recapture. And so some of those kinds of issues are part of how we function, are part of how our economies are designed, and anything that affects that changes our vulnerability as nations, changes our vulnerability as groups. And so all of the issues around delivering services, whether they're economic or otherwise, but certainly social services, are affected by climate. I want to sort of get quickly to just wrap this up. But social justice issues, again, if climate touches everything and the way we function is driven by how our societies are organized, then governance is one of the more important things. And governance in the context of how we organize and manage our business. Not just government providing services, all of us like the government must, but government actually functions in a particular way. And we have other ways of organizing ourselves through societies, through community groups, through churches, through many ways in which society organizes itself. So the governance, and we'll come back to this now a bit more tomorrow, but I want to keep in mind that part of social justice, part of how we function, is about how we organize ourselves, and politics and the political process is one way. Government is one mechanism. We place a lot of emphasis on it for a lot of reasons, because they do rulemaking and the allocation of resources. But the next issue is government and governing is access to resources, access to natural resources. Who makes the rules for where we fish, how we access certain resources, incentive programs for which groups, when to do what, and all of those things about the governance arrangements that are in place, and they make or break what we, the sort of social justice issues. They determine who has access and when and how. One of the things I want to spend some time on tomorrow, we don't have the time this morning to do it, but I want to introduce is the issue of the quality of our spaces, and it comes back to social justice, climate justice, and just transitions. Where we live, the conditions under which we live, where we play, where we work, how we connect. Sometimes we go to the beach, we fish, we sit, we commune with nature, we commune with some entity somewhere, and all of that affects our physical, mental, emotional health. When we lose those spaces for whatever reason, it may be a natural event, but it might be because somebody just put a hotel there or a marina or something else that affects us. Those are social justice issues which translate very easily under climate change conditions to this climate feature, this climate dimension to what is a normal social issue. And so again, because people are, well, we are the foundation of all we do. We are the foundation of all of these other strategies, economic and otherwise. How the quality of those spaces, are they available, and the quality of those spaces make a significant difference. And I want to keep that in mind as you hear people talk about green economy, blue economy, circular economy, all of these other things. They focus on the economic dimensions of what we do. But how does that translate to normal social issues and social justice issues, and therefore the climate dimensions of those issues? But I want to go back to something Dr. Rankin mentioned. Hotter days are hotter nights. Nice graphic. I mean, that was very vivid. What that means is that not only he mentioned cattle, or I think animals, and their being at the upper range, the same thing for animals. We've evolved on this planet in a particular temperature range. And we know what happened in the days if our bodies overheat. We know about heat deaths. Heat and cold deaths apparently are climbing globally, as we would expect if things are getting hotter. But cooling, the nighttime cooling of your body is important. If you don't get to cool down, it means therefore that your health, what might be a one-off issue when you overeat in the day, is now become a chronic problem, where you're not functioning well, you're more irritable, you're physically have a problem. And for those of us in the Caribbean, we understand that large parts of our population suffer from these what we call underlying problems in non-communicable diseases and so on. And so if you're already stressed, if you're not functioning at peak physical capacity, what happens when your body is stressed all the time? And so the implications for that issue in terms of climate, the climate dimensions, therefore, of normal health issues is tremendous. So I wanted to keep that in mind in terms of how we deal with these things. And so even we think we're helping by giving people concrete houses as opposed to board houses, we need to remember that this issue of heat and concrete concentrates heat and releases at night, and how you cool and the implications for wealth creation in terms of for your disposable income, for where you live and so on, becomes an issue. And we'll look at that in a bit more depth tomorrow. So just to make the connections between all the things we do and how we are organizing society, and to say climate adds a dimension to that, and how we respond determines whether or not the issues of inequality and justice are addressed. And I just want to wrap this up by saying tomorrow, in the sort of keynote, in the first thing, we will go a little deeper into some of these things around as they affect workers and work and people generally. So thank you for your patience, and I hope for those of us who don't work on social justice issues normally, that you begin to see some of those links in terms of how we function normally and how climate adds a dimension to those things, and therefore must be addressed as we work through today's different topics by our contributors. Thank you.